So Princess Anne reportedly walked into a closed parliamentary session carrying a battered document case that's apparently been sitting untouched in a Gatcombe Park strong room for almost 15 years. And within hours, according to what's being described, the entire narrative around how Prince Harry's early charitable funding was managed has been turned completely upside down. That's where this gets genuinely strange, because the way these papers surfaced, who actually authorized their release, and what's written in the handwritten annotations doesn't line up cleanly with anything the palace has acknowledged so far. King Charles is reportedly facing what insiders are calling one of the more serious institutional headaches of his reign, and the strangest part is that the documents allegedly detailing a scheme to quietly restrict Harry's charitable budget were never supposed to leave that strong room at all. Before we get into what actually happened, if you're into these deeper royal breakdowns with real timelines, go ahead and subscribe to Crown Signal Report, because this story is moving fast enough that missing a development means missing the whole thread. Here's the first thing that stands out. Anne, according to those familiar with her, doesn't typically hand over private family papers to any outside body without a formal request. That's simply not how she's operated for decades. So when she reportedly appeared before the committee with a worn case under her arm, the real question wasn't what was inside it. It was why now, and why voluntarily. The answer, according to insiders, is more interesting than the documents themselves. Investigators working an unrelated financial inquiry had reportedly recovered digital scans of several internal memos from a storage server registered to a long-dissolved charitable advisory panel. Once those scans surfaced, Anne was reportedly contacted directly, which apparently prompted her to bring the original physical papers forward herself to make sure their authenticity couldn't later be disputed. That detail matters, because it means the leak didn't start with her. Someone had already digitized those documents years earlier, and they'd been sitting quietly on an old server, waiting to be found. The case itself reportedly contained internal funding memos and correspondence dated between 2009 and 2013, papers that were supposedly locked away and largely forgotten. And yet the transfer log Anne presented to the committee clerk was apparently dated only 3 days before her appearance, stamped by the same financial crimes unit currently handling the broader server investigation. So the sequence goes roughly like this: original documents sealed away for over a decade, digital copies made at some unknown point, those copies sitting untouched on an old server, investigators stumbling onto them during an unrelated inquiry, and being notified, and bringing the originals forward herself. That's not a spontaneous development. That's something someone had apparently been sitting on for years, until the server discovery forced it into the open. Now here's where it gets more tangled. According to those who've reviewed the memos, several outline a formal internal proposal to gradually reduce funding routed through Harry's early charitable initiatives, citing administrative streamlining as the stated reason. But handwritten notes in the margins reportedly describe a very different underlying goal: limiting his public visibility and independent fundraising reach at a moment when his profile was, according to the notes, expanding faster than coordinated messaging could manage. When you look at what reportedly happened between 2010 and 2013, several of Harry's smaller initiatives apparently experienced unexplained delays in approval and funding disbursement, while comparable programs elsewhere in the family's charitable network continued without interruption. That's not a general budget tightening. That's targeted restriction, dressed up as routine administration. What makes this more than an old paperwork dispute is the signature block on the internal directive. According to those who've seen it, it was reportedly co-signed by a senior legal advisor who officially worked under the sovereign's private office, alongside a communications director whose formal role on paper had nothing to do with charitable funding decisions at all. When investigators cross-referenced that signature against personnel records recovered during the server investigation, they reportedly found the communications director had also been quietly consulting for an external media relations firm during that exact period, a connection that turns this from an internal funding dispute into something considerably larger. And then there's the meeting. The documents reportedly reference a private dinner held at a country house in Gloucestershire in early 2011, attended by 2 newspaper editors alongside that same communications director. Hotel records and an expense claim reportedly confirmed the private dining room was paid for through a discretionary account tied to the same office named in the funding memos. So you have palace-linked funds reportedly covering a private meeting with newspaper editors at a time when Harry's charitable budget was quietly being restricted. The pattern, according to those who've examined it, is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The question everyone keeps asking, understandably, is how King Charles could have been unaware of any of this at the time. According to those familiar with how the private office typically operates, day-to-day administrative decisions are usually handled well below the monarch's direct oversight, with only major briefs escalating upward. The memos in question, insiders suggest, were apparently filed and reviewed entirely within a mid-level administrative committee, never crossing Charles's desk during the period in question. That's reportedly a significant blind spot in how the household was run at the time, and the explanation for how these documents avoided detection for so long is arguably the most unsettling part of the whole story. According to those with knowledge of the digital trail, the files were apparently accessed years ago through an old external terminal tied to an advisory panel that had already been formally dissolved, meaning the transfer left no trace on the household's active internal systems. That's not an accident. That's infrastructure that appears to have been deliberately routed around active monitoring. A more recent memo, reportedly delivered to Charles within the last several weeks, apparently outlines a contingency plan to quietly restructure oversight of several charitable trusts if the ongoing inquiry results in formal findings against former senior staff. According to insiders, that memo's distribution list reportedly included at least 2 government officials, alongside a private office contact, meaning government figures were apparently receiving updates on an internal royal matter before the king's own office had fully briefed him. When Charles reportedly requested an urgent meeting with a senior civil servant, the response, according to those familiar with it, came back within the hour, suggesting preparation ahead of the request rather than genuine surprise. Meanwhile, according to sources, William's team took an entirely different approach, not out of direct involvement in this particular matter, but reportedly out of concern that unresolved questions about administrative interference in Harry's early charitable work could complicate broader trust arrangements the family relies on today. His legal advisors reportedly filed for expedited disclosure of the relevant records through formal channels, bypassing the usual internal review process entirely, a move insiders describe as a deliberate signal that this wasn't going to be handled quietly behind palace doors. Further complicating things, forensic accountants reportedly examining the same server discovered a secondary set of financial records tracing a portion of the discretionary funds used for that Gloucestershire meeting back to an account linked to the very charitable trust whose funding had been restricted in the first place. In other words, according to those familiar with the findings, money apparently diverted from Harry's own charitable initiative may have partly funded the media outreach effort connected to limiting his visibility. If accurate, insiders say that detail alone transforms this from an internal disagreement into something closer to a genuine accountability question. Then there's the archive itself. According to those familiar with her research, Anne reportedly returned to the Gatcombe strong room and located an older notebook, kept separately from the primary case, containing handwritten entries dated to 1999, years before any of the more recent documents. The notebook apparently detailed early meetings between household advisors and press contacts regarding long-term strategies for managing public attention on the younger royals. Tucked into its back cover was reportedly a short handwritten note explaining that these particular pages had been quietly removed from an official file decades earlier, kept privately as a kind of insurance record rather than destroyed. One page, according to those who examined it, had been cleanly torn out, leaving only a blank space where an entry should have been. Anne reportedly checked the surrounding pages for any faint impression left by a pen, and using a simple pencil rubbing technique against the page beneath, a partial name apparently became visible, reportedly belonging to a former senior legal figure from that era. Whoever removed that page, insiders suggest, did so quickly rather than carefully, since the impression was still recoverable more than 2 decades later. Outside the public eye, reaction has reportedly been building quickly. Several commentators and advocacy groups focused on charitable transparency have apparently called for a formal independent review of how royal-linked charitable funds were administered during that period. Some members of Parliament, according to reports, are now pushing for broader oversight discussions regarding how discretionary funds tied to royal households are tracked and disclosed going forward. Throughout all of this, Buckingham Palace has reportedly maintained near total public silence, declining to comment while related inquiries remain active. According to a source familiar with internal palace discussions, legal advisors have apparently cautioned strongly against any public statement that could be seen as prejudicing ongoing findings. That silence, whatever its legal justification, is reportedly being read publicly less as caution and more as an institution struggling to get ahead of a story it no longer fully controls. So when you step back and look at the full picture, the inconsistencies are hard to ignore. The stated reason for reduced charitable funding doesn't match the targeted pattern the documents apparently describe. The claim that senior leadership was unaware doesn't sit comfortably next to signature blocks reportedly naming senior advisors directly. And an old family archive that was supposedly disconnected from any of this turned out to contain a deliberately torn page, its missing content still faintly recoverable more than 20 years later. The deeper implication, according to those following this closely, isn't really about any single meeting or memo. It's the suggestion of a longer-running administrative pattern, one that reportedly used funding decisions and quiet media coordination to manage how a rising royal figure's public profile was allowed to grow. And the only reason any of it has come to light now is that old digital copies, apparently forgotten for years, resurfaced during an entirely unrelated inquiry. That's not usually how a carefully executed plan comes apart. That's typically how one quietly falls apart on its own, once enough time and enough loose threads accumulate. The institution now finds itself balancing pressure for public accountability against the instinct toward careful, controlled silence that has defined it for generations. And for the first time in a long while, according to those watching closely, it isn't entirely clear which instinct is going to win out. There's another thread worth pulling on before wrapping up, and it involves the timing of Anne's own appearance before the committee. According to parliamentary scheduling records, the session she attended had originally been set aside for a routine, unrelated procedural matter. Her name reportedly didn't appear on any public witness list beforehand. And yet, according to those familiar with the building's internal logs, her access credentials had apparently been processed and ready well before the session opened that morning, arranged through a request that notably wasn't formally logged under her own office. That detail has led some observers to quietly wonder whether the decision to bring the archive forward was entirely her own initiative, or whether someone else had already set the pieces in motion and simply needed her cooperation to make it happen cleanly. That question extends to the former communications director named in the original memos as well. According to those familiar with her more recent history, she reportedly stepped away from any official role years ago under an agreement that included standard confidentiality terms, and yet the digital files eventually recovered by investigators reportedly dated back to a period well before her departure, suggesting she, or someone with access to her old systems, had been holding on to that material for a considerable stretch of time without acting on it. Those close to the investigation describe her as largely private in the years since, rarely making public appearances, which has only added to the sense that whatever she was sitting on was being kept for a very specific reason rather than simply forgotten. None of this, according to royal commentators following the story, points to a single clean villain or a simple resolution. What it increasingly resembles instead is a tangled web of old loyalties, quiet grievances, and administrative decisions made years ago by people who likely never expected any of it to resurface in this much detail. Some of those involved may have genuinely believed they were managing a difficult period responsibly. Others, based on what's emerged so far, appear to have been protecting something considerably more self-interested. Untangling which is which, insiders suggest, is likely to take considerably longer than the initial headlines have implied. For the family itself, the practical fallout is reportedly still unfolding in real time. Harry's own team, according to those familiar with the situation, has so far declined any public comment, a silence some read as measured caution, and others read as quiet vindication of grievances he's aired publicly in the past regarding how his early years in public life were managed. William's more direct legal approach, meanwhile, has reportedly been interpreted by some close to the family less as solidarity with his brother specifically, and more as a broader effort to ensure the institution's financial and administrative structures can withstand this level of scrutiny without further damage. Charles, according to those close to him, has reportedly been focused less on managing public perception in the immediate term and more on establishing exactly how far back this pattern actually extends and how much of it may still be quietly operating in some form today. Whether that internal reckoning ever becomes fully public, or whether it remains something handled carefully behind closed doors, may end up defining how this entire chapter is eventually remembered as a genuine turning point toward transparency, or simply another difficult story the institution managed to quietly outlast.